It was a neighbor's dog that started the story all over again. On a spring day in 1984, a dog brought a human skull back to a house near Calder Road in League City, and what followed was the discovery of a body in a 25-acre patch of marsh and oil fields that would come to be known as the Calder Road killing fields. You know, there's something about a dog finding a skull that feels like a line from a nightmare, and yet it happened.
Yeah, Claire, it's hard to shake that image. The Calder Road site is narrow in scope, about 25 acres off Calder Road in League City, but it sits in a much larger, darker picture, the I-45 corridor between Houston and Galveston. That stretch of highway, over decades, became associated with dozens of missing girls and women whose bodies turned up in fields, ditches, bayous, and marshland.
Right, and for our listeners today, this episode is about the Texas killing fields, which broadly refers to that I-45 corridor and, more specifically, to that small League City field where 4 women were dumped between 1983 and 1991. It's eerie and, frankly, heartbreaking how such a small place can hold so many unanswered questions.
It is. The larger corridor spans murders and disappearances from roughly the early 1970s through the 2000s, and at least 34 bodies have been found in that general area during that period. The victims were mostly girls and young women, many between 12 and 25, last seen near I-45, at convenience stores, nightclubs, or on the side of the road. The geography and the culture of the highway made them vulnerable.
By the way, I grew up between Houston and Galveston, so the I-45 corridor is familiar in a way that makes these cases feel, I don't know, closer. The road connects so many different lives: tourists, truckers, commuters, runaways. That transience helped predators move through the area without attracting attention. Claire,
Marcus, you want me to unpack that? Why the highway mattered?
Yes, Marcus. Tell our listeners why that stretch of road, so ordinary to some, became a channel for these crimes.
Sure. During the 60s to the 80s, Houston grew fast. Oil, NASA, the ship channel. That growth meant lots of transient workers, long-haul truckers, and people passing through. I-45 became a busy artery, but it also created pockets of isolation, exits that led to marshy land, dirt roads, oil fields. Those spots were easy to get to from the highway and equally easy to disappear into. Couple that with weak coordination among the multiple jurisdictions along the corridor: Houston, League City, Galveston County, Brazoria County, and you get an environment where disappearances could be misclassified and evidence fragmented.
And too often, missing girls were written off as runaways. That attitude, dismissing disappearances, delayed investigations, and in some cases, it may have allowed predators to continue. We see that in early cases like Brooks Bracewell and Georgia Geer.
Exactly. Those 2 girls were last seen in 1974 at a convenience store off I-45, and police initially treated them as runaways. Serious investigative work didn't come for years. That pattern, young women missing, not immediately believed, and bodies found later in isolated places, repeats itself through the decades. Right.
Let's go back to the early 1970s for a moment, so listeners understand how the killing fields reputation began. I want to run through a few early victims: Allison Ann Craven, Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson, Kimberly Pitchford, Brooks Bracewell, and Georgia Geer. Tell us the essentials, Marcus.
Allison Ann Craven was just 12, disappeared November 9, 1971, from an apartment near I-45. Parts of her remains were found about 3 months later in a field near her home, and the rest of her skeleton was found in February 1972 in Pearland. Debbie Catherine Ackerman and Maria Talbot Johnson, both 15, were last seen November 15, 1971, hitchhiking from Galveston to Houston. Witnesses saw them get into a white van. 2 days later, their bodies were found bound, partially nude, in Turner's Bayou near Texas City. They had been shot and apparently sexually assaulted. Kimberly Ray Pitchford, 16, last seen January 3, 1973, at Dobie High School for a driving test. She was found January 5 in a ditch near Angleton. And Brooks Bracewell, 12, and Georgia Carolyn Gear, 14, were last seen September 6, 1974, at a U-Totem store. Police treated them as runaways and only years later re-examined the scene, finding skeletal remains and clothing fragments in Alvin. These early cases set a pattern. Young females, last seen near public places along I-45, bodies later found in fields or bayous.
It's chilling to hear the pattern spelled out like that. Now, Edward Harold Bell enters the story later and complicates everything. Marcus, can you summarize who he was and what he claimed?
Bell was a convicted killer and sex offender. He'd murdered a man in 1978 and became a fugitive for many years before being arrested in Panama in 1993. While in prison in 1998, he wrote letters to a prosecutor claiming responsibility for 11 murders of young girls from 1971 to 1977, calling them the 11 that went to heaven. Among the names he mentioned were several linked to the I-45 corridor: Debbie Ackerman, Maria Johnson, Kimberly Pitchford, Sharon Shaw, and others. The trouble is, authorities never found sufficient physical evidence to charge him with those murders. He remained a prime suspect to some, but he died in prison in 2019 without being charged for most of those crimes.
That 11 that went to heaven line, it gives you chills and also a knot in your stomach. Families want answers, and jailhouse confessions can be maddening. Sometimes genuine, sometimes manipulative. Marcus, what should families make of those letters?
It's complicated. On the one hand, confessions can provide closure. They can direct investigators to evidence or victims. On the other hand, the absence of corroborating physical evidence means we can't simply accept a claim at face value. Prison inmates sometimes claim responsibility for crimes they didn't commit for attention, bargaining power, or to harass victims' families. For investigators, the letters are leads, not convictions. For families, they're often a cruel mix of hope and doubt.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift to Calder Road itself, because that's the heart of the Killing Fields mythos. 4 women found there between 1983 and 1991. We'll walk through each of them. Heidi Villarreal, Laura Miller, the long unidentified Jane Doe, later identified as Audrey Lee Cook, and Janet Doe, later identified as Donna Prudhomme. Would you lead us through their stories, Marcus?
Of course. Heidi Marie Villarreal was 25, a cocktail waitress in League City, last seen October 10, 1983, at a convenience store on West Main and Hobbs. Her remains were discovered April 4, 1984, when a dog found a skull near the Calder Road field. Laura Lynn Miller was 16, a sophomore at Clear Creek High who had epilepsy. She was last seen September 10, 1984, at the same convenience store payphone where Heidi had been seen. Her remains were found February 3, 1986, about 60 feet from where Heidi was found. Then there was the woman known for decades as Jane Doe, eventually identified in 2019 as Audrey Lee Cook, born November 25, 1955, a mechanic who worked in the Houston area. She was discovered in 1986 during searches for Laura Miller. And Janet Doe, later identified in 2019 as Donna Gonsalon Prudhomme, born April 23, 1957, was found in 1991. Both Cook and Prudhomme remained unidentified for years until DNA and genetic genealogy brought names to those remains.
Those identifications in 2019, Audrey Cook and Donna Prudhomme, were a big moment, weren't they? They show how modern science can restore names to the nameless, but they also leave the killer, or killers, unaccountable.
Exactly. DNA and genetic genealogy can reopen doors. The FBI assisted League City PD in those efforts, and the identifications gave families names and stories again. But finding a name for the victim doesn't automatically give you the perpetrator. Evidence had been degraded by time and environment. Witnesses age or die. Investigators have said they lean toward a single killer for the Calder Road 4, but they've also been careful not to rule out multiple offenders. Right.
Let's pause a beat and talk about why that field was so attractive to a killer. There's that line from the FBI, "If they cried for help, no one would hear." Explain the landscape, physically, so listeners can picture it, Marcus.
The Calder Road field sits amid flat, marshy land dotted with oil pumps and dirt roads, very sparse housing and businesses in the 1980s. It's accessible by vehicle from I-45, but rarely trafficked. It offered seclusion, close enough to the highway for quick access, and remote enough that someone dumping a body expected it would remain undisturbed. The combination of humidity, flooding, and wildlife also accelerates decomposition and scatters evidence, so even if remains are found, critical forensic traces can be gone.
You can almost hear the silence out there. Okay. Beyond Calder Road, many other cases along I-45 merit attention. Laura Smither, Jessica Cain, Kelli Cox, Shelley Sykes, and more. Let's talk about William Lewis Reece, the man who ended up being linked to several 1997 murders in the corridor. Marcus, what's the Reece story?
William Lewis Reece is a convicted serial offender with a long criminal history. In May 1997, he was arrested for the kidnapping and attempted murder of Sandra Sapah, who escaped by jumping from his moving truck. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison for that crime. Years later, DNA links connected Reece to murders in Oklahoma, and in 2015, his DNA matched a sample in the murder of Tiffany Johnston. After those links were made, Reece cooperated with investigators and led them to the remains of Jessica Cain and Kelli Cox, two 1997 victims found in 2016. He later confessed to killing Laura Smither as well and pleaded guilty in Texas in 2022 to the murders of Smither, Cain, and Cox, receiving multiple life sentences. He's the only offender publicly confirmed to have killed multiple women associated with the killing field's orbit.
So, Reece accounts for some of the later crimes, particularly in the late 1990s. But he doesn't explain the Calder Road victims or the early 1970s cases. That brings us back to the big, gnawing question. Was there one serial killer or many? Marcus, I'm handing this to you. What's the evidence say?
The evidence points strongly toward multiple killers. The timeline stretches more than 3 decades. It's highly unlikely a single offender operated consistently across 35 years. We have confirmed different offenders. Reece for the 1997 cases, King and Zwarst connected to the mid-80s Shelley Sykes case, Potentially Bell in the 70s if his claims hold up. People like Clyde Hedrick and Mark Stallings as local persons of interest. Victim profiles and modes of killing vary. Some were shot, others strangled, some sexually assaulted, others less clear. The pragmatic law enforcement view by the 1990s was that the corridor was a hunting ground used by multiple predators, not a single monster. Yet for the Calder Road 4, some investigators have hypothesized a single offender given the small, defined dump site. It's possible, but not proven. Yeah.
We should dive into some of the other suspects and controversies. Michael Lloyd Self, for instance, and the troubling interrogation history tied to his conviction. Marcus, can you explain what happened there and why it's important?
Michael Lloyd Self was a gas station attendant arrested in 1972 for the murders of Rhonda Johnson and Sharon Shaw. He confessed after long interrogation sessions, but he later recanted, alleging severe coercion and torture by law enforcement, specifically by then Police Chief Don Morris and Deputy Tommy Deal. Self was convicted in 1974 and sentenced to life. In the years after, Morris and Deal themselves were arrested and convicted on unrelated charges, including torture and misconduct, which cast doubt on the integrity of Self's confession. Self died in prison in 2000, and many now question whether he was wrongly convicted. The case highlights how investigative misconduct can derail justice and leave the real perpetrator at large.
That's one of the most painful parts of this whole story. Cases possibly closed through coerced confessions, while the truth remains out there. Families deserve better than that. Another name that comes up a lot is Clyde Hedrick. What's his connection?
Clyde Hedrick was a local construction worker with prior convictions, including for sexual offenses. He was associated with the 1985 death of Ellen Beeson, whose body was found in Galveston County, and was linked by some to other killings near the corridor. Initially, he was convicted on lesser charges related to abusing a corpse, but later the exhumation and reanalysis of Beeson's remains led to a murder conviction. People like Laura Miller's father publicly pushed for Hedrick to be considered in other cases, including Calder Road victims, but as of the latest public records, he has not been charged in those Calder Road murders. He remains a controversial figure in the larger narrative. Right.
Mark Stallings also confessed to a killing, didn't he? But it's complicated.
Yes. Mark Roland Stallings, a convicted kidnapper serving life, told investigators in 2013 he had killed a woman in 1991 and dumped her in the Texas fields, a statement later linked to Donna Prudhomme. Stallings had lived in League City and was near the area at times, which raised interest. But even with his alleged confession, as of the last public updates, he hasn't been criminally charged with those murders. Again, you see the pattern: claims, leads, persons of interest, yet no definitive public charging for Calder Road.
It's maddening. Families have been left to be investigators sometimes. Tim Miller and Texas EquiSearch is an example. We should talk about the family's role. Marcus?
Tim Miller, Laura Miller's father, became a high-profile advocate. He founded Texas EquiSearch in 2000 to help locate missing persons using volunteers, horses, ATVs, community search efforts that have helped find hundreds of people. Families like his have both challenged and collaborated with law enforcement, pushing for renewed investigation, better cooperation between agencies, and the use of new technologies. Their advocacy gave momentum to some cases and brought public pressure for answers.
Yeah. Let's talk about forensics. How did we move from dental records to modern DNA and then to genetic genealogy? That shift gave us the identifications of Audrey Cook and Donna Prudhomme in 2019. Explain the arc for listeners.
In the 1980s, identifications relied heavily on dental records and sometimes fingerprints. Heidi Villarreal and Laura Miller were identified that way. But Jane and Janet Doe, later Cook and Prudhomme, remained anonymous because dental and fingerprint records didn't yield matches, and missing person databases were limited. Fast forward to the 2010s. DNA profiling and national databases like CODIS allowed cross-jurisdictional matches. Then genetic genealogy emerged, using public DNA ancestry databases and genealogists to build family trees from unknown DNA profiles. In 2019, coordinated work between League City PD and the FBI used genetic genealogy to identify Audrey Cook and Donna Prudhomme. Those identifications were major breakthroughs in returning names to the victims.
It's a rare moment of cautious hope in an otherwise grim story. Science reminding us that names can be returned. But the same technology raises questions. Can genetic genealogy also produce identifications of perpetrators? And are there limitations?
It can, and it has in many cold cases, by creating family leads that point investigators toward potential suspects. But limitations remain. Environmental degradation can mean we have little or no usable DNA. Evidence may be contaminated or lost, and privacy or database restrictions can hamper searches. Plus, the longer the time since the crime, the more likely key witnesses are gone and records are incomplete. Even when you identify a suspect through genealogy, you still need traditional corroboration to prosecute. Yeah.
I want to acknowledge other notable cases, often folded into the Killingfield story. Laura Smither, Jessica Cain, Kelli Cox, Shelley Sykes, Sarah Ann Lewis Trusty, and Teresa Venegas. For listeners, these aren't footnotes. Their lives lost. Marcus, summarize a couple of these with the facts we have.
Laura Smither, 12, disappeared on April 3, 1997 after going for a jog. Her body was found April 19th in a retention pond near Pasadena. Her case drew major community searches. Jessica Cain, 17, was last seen early on August 17, 1997, leaving a Bennigan's near Baybrook Mall. Her pickup was found abandoned on I-45 near Lamarck, and her remains weren't recovered until March 18th. Reece led investigators to her site. Kelli Cox, 20, vanished July 15, 1997. In 2016, her remains were found where Reece had led investigators. Shelley Sykes disappeared in 1986 after driving near I-45. Her car was found abandoned, and although John Robert King and Gerald Peter Zwarst later confessed to kidnapping and raping her, they said she died during the assault and her body hasn't been recovered. These cases show the corridor's persistence as a deadly locus across decades.
Each name brings a family, friends, a life. On the systemic side, the corridor cut across jurisdictions. That fragmentation, Marcus, how did that shape investigations?
The corridor's multiple jurisdictions meant records, leads, and physical evidence could be siloed. In the 70s and 80s, data sharing was weak, and the culture often treated missing teenagers as runaways. That delay and fragmentation prevented patterns from being readily apparent. Only later, with bombed-in forensic capabilities and federal assistance like the FBI, did cross-jurisdictional coordination improve. But by then, decades had passed and evidence had eroded.
Yeah.
Right.
We should spend time on the question that's in everyone's mind when they hear Killingfields. Is there one killer or many? You said earlier, evidence favors many. let's drill into why people cling to the single killer story.
Human psychology. We want a single coherent story. One villain, one motive, one end. It's simpler, and it produces a sense of closure if you find that one person. Media also likes neat narratives, but the facts resist that simplification. Different MOs, different victim profiles, confirmed convictions for multiple offenders, these all point to multiple killers using a similar geography for dumping bodies. The killing fields label is powerful and evocative, but it can obscure the complexity. It's likely a corridor of opportunity exploited by different predators across time.
There's a moral component here, too. If the public wants a single villain, families may feel pressure to accept a simple answer, even if nuances are being ignored. Marcus, we haven't talked about the role of media in documentaries. How did shows like Unsolved Mysteries and recent Netflix coverage affect investigations?
Media coverage raised national awareness and often generated new tips. The 1993 Unsolved Mysteries episode and later docuseries, including Netflix's crime scene The Texas Killing Fields, brought renewed public focus on suspects like Bell and Hedrick and reintroduced cold leads. But there's a double edge. Media can oversimplify or sensationalize, promoting the one killer myth, while also putting families under a public microscope. Still, high-profile coverage has had concrete benefits: new information, renewed investigative interest, and sometimes a push toward advanced forensic analysis.
Okay. Let's consider the limits of closure. Some likely killers have died, like Edward Harold Bell. What does justice mean when the likely perpetrator is dead, unidentified, or unprosecutable?
Justice is complicated in those cases. For families, naming the responsible party, even posthumously, can bring some relief. But without a trial, there's no public airing of evidence and no legal accountability. And when a suspected perpetrator dies without being charged, take Bell, who died in 2019, we're left with an unsettled ledger, a suspect believed by some, refuted by others. For communities, the goal often shifts from prosecution to truth, documenting what happened, acknowledging victims, and implementing systemic changes to prevent repeat harms.
Right.
Right.
We mustn't forget that some convictions did come. Reece, King, Zwarst, though in some cases bodies weren't found. There's also the painful question of mishandling, torture, coerced confessions, dismissed tips. What lessons should law enforcement and the public take from the Killing Fields saga?
Several lessons. Treat missing persons seriously from day one, particularly minors and vulnerable adults. Improve interagency communication and data sharing along corridors. Preserve evidence and maintain chain of custody. Avoid coercive interrogation tactics that undermine justice. Invest in cold case units and forensic resources, including DNA and genealogical tools. Finally, listen to families. Advocates like Tim Miller often press for resources and attention that bodies of work may otherwise lack.
And on a human level, remember the victims were people with lives, jobs, families, friends. The identifications of Cook and Prudhomme restored names and small pieces of dignity to those lives. Marcus, what are the biggest open questions still haunting investigators?
Lots of big open questions. Who specifically killed the 4 women at Calder Road? Is there a realistic path to solving those murders now? How many killers actually operated along I-45 between 1971 and the 2000s? Were some victims connected to Edward Harold Bell's letters? And if so, how do we corroborate that? How many cases were mishandled early on and need to be reopened? Will genetic genealogy identify more victims or perpetrators, or has time and environment destroyed too much evidence? And finally, what does justice look like when the likely killer is dead or unprosecutable?
Those are big, heavy questions.
They are.
Before we close, Marcus, wait,
Yeah?
can you walk listeners through a hypothetical path forward for investigators hoping to solve Calder Road now? What would actually need to happen?
Investigators would need several things aligning. First, any preserved physical evidence from the Calder Road recoveries should be re-examined in modern labs. Trace DNA, touch DNA, anything that might yield profiles. Second, investigators should continue to exploit genetic genealogy where possible, creating investigative leads from even degraded profiles. Third, revisit witness statements and old investigative files with fresh eyes. Sometimes a fresh interview yields memory details missed earlier. Fourth, coordinate across jurisdictions to cross-check missing person reports and offender databases. And finally, follow up on persons of interest, people who lived or worked near Calder Road in the 1980s and 1990s, re-interviewing where possible, and checking historical movements like employment and travel patterns. None of those steps is guaranteed, but together they increase the chance of a breakthrough.
It's not comforting, but it is practical, and that matters. Listeners sometimes ask, is the Killingfield story unique to Houston, or do we see this elsewhere? Marcus?
The pattern isn't unique. Highway corridors and isolated dump sites show up across North America. The Highway of Tears in Canada, or TASEs tied to truck stop routes in the U.S., show similar vulnerabilities: isolated stretches, transient populations, and poor surveillance. I-45 gained notoriety because of the number and clustering of cases, the media attention, and the dramatic name. But the underlying problem, corridors of opportunity exploited by predators, appears elsewhere.
Right.
Right.
I want to read a quote from one of the FBI updates. If they cried for help, no one would hear. That line captures both the geography and the moral problem, a place where silence and isolation allowed terrible crimes to be hidden. Marcus, any final thoughts before we wrap?
We need to hold two truths at once: that science gives us tools, DNA, genetic genealogy, better databases that can and have returned names and helped prosecute offenders, and that institutional failures, dismissal of missing persons, fragmented jurisdictions, coercion, left victims vulnerable for decades. The Calder Road 4, the dozens of other victims along I-45, and the families who still grieve deserve persistent, careful work. Hope comes from continued investigation, improved forensics, and communities holding systems accountable.
Thank you, Marcus. To close, I want to return to the human side. Heidi Villarreal Fye, Laura Miller, Audrey Cook, Donna Prudhomme, these were women with jobs, families, stories. Their remains were found in one small field, but their lives traced through neighborhoods and workplaces and loved ones. For each name returned, a family got a piece of their story back. For each case unsolved, someone still waits.
If you're listening and you have information, no matter how small, that might help any of these cases, reach out to law enforcement. Old tips matter. DNA technology changes, and a question you ask a relative or a detail you remember might be the missing piece. Families and investigators need the public's help.
And to the families who've carried this burden for decades, we hear you. We see your advocacy. Your insistence on answers has changed how these cases are approached and has saved others. For now, the Texas killing fields remind us that geography, time, and human failure can create unspeakable harm, but also that persistence, science, and community can claw back truth.
Yeah.
On our next episode, we'll look at another highway corridor case and compare investigative approaches, what's worked, what hasn't, and what victims' families can expect from modern cold case units. Thank you for joining us for this somber and important conversation. I'm Claire Mendoza.
And I'm Dr. Marcus Ellison. Thanks for listening to Still Unanswered. Stay safe out there. And don't forget, names matter.